Thanks for joining today's session about data security. My name is Adam Rosen, and today we're going to talk about how to protect your most valuable asset, your information. So again, my name is Adam Rosen. I'm responsible for data access governance solutions here at Stealthbits Technologies. And at Stealthbits, we're all about credentials, data, and systems. These things are interdependent and interrelated and all critical to your security posture as an organization. It starts with data access governance and understanding where you have sensitive information, who has access to it, what they're doing with it, proactively stopping that information from being abused, mishandled, or exfiltrated, and then implementing the right controls and policies to maintain a least privilege model on an ongoing basis. That is directly related to the credential stores that underlie those various data repositories, as well as the systems that are hosting those data repositories and accessing those data repositories. So that's the three-pronged approach: credentials, data, and systems. I encourage you to think a little bit deeper about, when I say who has access to sensitive information, I'm not always just talking about permissions, but who could gain access, right? If I have the ability within Active Directory to reset the password of another user that has access to that data, that's just as good as having access to it myself. Or if I could reset the password of another user and then use that user's account to add myself to a security group that would make me a local administrator on that server, then from the system level I could take ownership of that content, give myself permission, and I'm off to the races. So that's what I'm talking about when I say credentials, data, and systems, all as critical part of your data security practice. So I want to start with data governance as a whole. What's it all about? What does it mean? And then get into a solution. How do we address the common problems and achieve your security objectives? And I'll show you that through the lens of our technology, through the Stealthbits platform, in the form of a use case demo to wrap it all up. So first and foremost, what is data access governance? Well, it's all about making access to data exclusive and ensuring that only the right people have access to the information they need to do their job, nothing more, nothing less, and maintaining privileges at the lowest level possible going forward. I'm sure you're all familiar with the different challenges to achieving this least privilege model. And it's going to be different with different data repositories, but in general, complex entitlement structures don't make it any easier. You always have unknown risks. You always have excessive access, right? More people with privileges than those who need it, and ever-evolving compliance requirements are tough to keep up with. And this takes different forms across all the different systems you might be thinking about, whether it's structured data, unstructured data, on-prem, in the cloud. Everything's a little bit different, but I want to give you both a general and a specific approach you can take away from this. So at a very high level, these are the 5 phases of maturity to achieving data access governance. So first and foremost, everything begins with discovery. You need to know where the data lives, or else you really can't go down the path of understanding the risks associated with it, let alone remediating those risks. So first and foremost, when I say discovery, I mean that in the most fundamental way. Think about host discovery, both on-prem and in the cloud. You need to know what kind of systems you have and what they're doing. So where do I have Exchange servers, SQL servers, SharePoint farms, file shares? The file shares can live, in all kinds of places, whether on NAS devices, Windows servers. Those are probably the places you expect to find file shares, but you're just as likely to find them, file shares from workstations that maybe shouldn't have file shares. So good host level discovery and searching for things like file shares, SharePoint farms, SQL instances, Exchange roles, all of that is a really good place to start. Once you have an idea of what these different hosts are responsible for, then we can go down the path of trying to answer some of these critical questions. So then you scan a level deeper, right? You want to go out over the network and scan for things like what kind of information exists there? Is it sensitive? Is it regulated? Who has access to it? Who created that content? Who does it belong to? It's all kind of part of phase 2. But really moving into phase 3, these things get easier when you contextualize it with activity information. So when I'm talking about monitoring, think about this in the context of the platforms that you're working with. But on a file share, that would be things like who's reading and writing different documents, who's creating files, who's moving files from one place to another. and using that as context, not just as an audit trail to, of course, say, did somebody access the sensitive information or not, but also to facilitate remediation going forward. You want to know the differential between who has access to a particular type of content and who's actively utilizing that content. Furthermore, that's going to aid your threat response. You start running these events through user behavior analytics. Now you can see things like someone accessing data in a way they normally don't, or doing something that's not typical for their job function, or someone's copying a bunch of sensitive files down from a Windows server to their local workstation. All of those things you want to identify and prevent proactively. That might take different forms across different platforms. When we get into databases, obviously activity is looking at SQL statements and what queries were executed. Somebody select from a sensitive table, or something else that might be suspicious or out of the ordinary. So keep this in context of the platform that you're working with. But in general, I'm going to start with the unstructured data. I think from a governance standpoint, those things tend to grow unruly the fastest, just because of the way users are interacting with that data so directly. Then we get into restructuring access, right? So once we know the differential between who has access to content and who's actually utilizing those permissions, then we can start to run that differential and not just get to a least privilege model, but restructure everything so that you've got your groups aligned for good governance going forward, and you remove some of those interdependencies that make data management and data access management challenging. Then that positions you for governance, which is phase 5, is to put those right reviews in place so that on an ongoing basis, people within the different business units can attest to who should or shouldn't have access to content, and you always maintain an immutable audit trail of who was given access to what and when, and who approved it and why. So let's talk about that a little bit. When we go down the path of restructuring access, there are really 3 core ingredients that are going to help you automate this. First of which, of course, is the permissions, right? So just untangling what's on the access control list and the nesting conditions and groups inside of groups to figure out the effect of who can access this resource right now. Call that current permissions. Then we also want to combine that with the activity to understand who's actually utilizing their permissions and who is not. And then you've got the content level analysis. So we're going to prioritize areas that contain sensitive or regulated information. So if you look at this picture on the left, probably quite a few problems that jump out at you right away, right? First and foremost, we've got this everyone group on the access control list. Could be, think about everyone, domain users, authenticated users. Any kind of global access group is generally doesn't belong in most places. Furthermore, could even just be a large multi-purpose security group. Maybe I added a group that is used for all kinds of different things. And not only is it letting people into this folder, but people depend on that group membership for access to an application or access to another folder or a SharePoint site or whatever. It's equally problematic because now you can't remove people without breaking other things. Then you've got single users, assigned directly to the access control list, which of course is a management nightmare, when it comes time to revoke or change or really do anything with those privileges. It's not ideal to have them directly assigned to the access control list. So you can see we're working with a departmental share here. This is for the accounting department. And over here on the right is your ideal model, right? This is what you really want to achieve to manage this properly going forward. So I'm going to talk about how we automate the transformation from this inconsistent, messy permission model to something clean, consistent, least privileged, and ready to go for ongoing governance and recertification. So you notice that I'm directly aligned here, where the resource and the groups have a one-to-one relationship. This group's sole purpose is to provide read access to the accounting share. And this group's sole purpose is to provide read, write, and modify to the accounting share. And then I've got a full control group here for my administrators. But again, it only impacts my accounting share. Changing the memberships of those groups isn't going to impact any other resources. So what you want to do is, with the Stealthbits tool, run an automated remediation that's going to analyze all the different file shares that you have in the environment, whichever ones you bring into scope for remediation. It's going to analyze the contents of those access control lists, not just to come up with what level of permissions exist today and who has what kind of access, but also to compare that to their behavior. So now we use that activity stream to look at who's reading, who's writing, and who's not using their privileges at all. And it's going to take that differential and it's going to provision new groups for you in accordance with your naming convention. And it's going to give you that one-to-one alignment where now it creates groups named after your shares, puts those groups on those shares, and puts the right people in the right groups, leaving out any folks that don't need their access anymore. Someone who had privilege and was not using it is going to be excluded from this transformation. So once you've done that, I've now got a clean, consistent permissions model, got a read group, a read-write group, a full control group, and this has achieved three things. I've effectively eliminated inadvertent granting or revoking of access by removing those interdependencies. I've aligned access with least privilege principles by making sure that only people who need rights have rights to a given resource. And I've positioned everything for actionable governance going forward, which I'll show you now. So, well, before I go into the actionable governance, a lot of you are probably thinking, well, resource-based groups are nice, but what about all my roles, right? I've got a sales department, and I've got a role for the sales managers, and another role for the sales reps, and the marketing administrators, and whomever else, right? I want to be able to utilize those roles when I'm provisioning access to unstructured data. So you're exactly on the right track if that's what you're thinking. So let me go a level deeper here. In addition to creating those resource-based groups, at the share level, I've got one for my readers and one for my writers. Now you want to nest your roles and your exceptions. You're always going to have exceptions with unstructured data. You never want to back yourself into a model where you can only do role-based groups. It's going to be a big mess. Think about, a sales folder where sales managers have read and write access and the sales reps have read-only access. Well, maybe somebody from another department is doing a project, and for at least a temporary basis, this particular person has requested access to this resource. You don't want to add them to that role. That doesn't make any sense. I don't need anything else that a sales rep would need or that a sales manager would need. I just need to get access to this one particular resource. This always happens with unstructured data, and you need to be able to accommodate it outside of your roles. That's why we've got our roles and our exceptions nested within our resource-based groups. So you've got role-based access inside of your resource-based groups, giving you the best of both worlds. So you carry that forward into a remediation. Think about what I said before. You've got this large over-permissive security group, and an extreme example, it could be a global access group, like everyone, domain users, authenticated users. We're just going to flesh out for you who truly needs those rights and then place them where they belong, accommodating your roles and your exceptions along the way. So you can have a role-based approach within a resource-based group model. Now, starting down the path of this remediation, you want to prioritize risk, not just based on where you have the most sensitive data, but where it's most likely to be compromised. So that takes into account, again, both permissions and activity. If you have equal density of sensitive information in two different areas, you want to consider which area is more heavily trafficked and which area has more permissive rights. If thousands of people have access to one repository and other repositories fairly secured, which one's going to be the priority. If you've got two equally permissive areas, you want to look at what's more heavily trafficked. But again, this all goes into risk scoring and helps you make good decisions about what to clean up first. So in addition to prioritizing risk, you also want to think about who the data belongs to and start to empower those people to make decisions about who has access to it. So calculating ownership is done by looking at document metadata, activity, and attributes, right? So starting with document metadata, who has created this content, right? In this case, it looks like Adam Laub created the majority of the files that exist within this particular area. Furthermore, we can see that George has performed 85% of the activity on those particular resources. So if we pivot those two things together, now we're going to grab user attribute, right? We're going to look at that managed by attribute. So we know who created most of the content. We know who works with it the most. And by pivoting on that managed by attribute, we know they both report to the same person. So in that case, the person who manages Adam and George is most likely the person who should be making decisions about rights to this folder. So that's how we're going to start to assign ownership to the different areas and really get into who ought to be the proper custodian and make decisions about who should have access. So now that we have a suspected owner, we want to go down the path of verification, right? So sending emails out to those suspected owners and let them confirm or deny, yes, this is mine, or no, this belongs to somebody else. So then from the vantage point of the owner, now we want them to participate in these reviews on a periodic basis, right? So if it's a monthly or quarterly review cycle, they're going to get an email that says it's time to submit your monthly review. And they click the link in that email. And now not only as the data owner am I getting this view into here's everybody who has access to my resource, but some recommendations about how it's being utilized. So this is my resource. I know it better than anybody. That's why I've been tasked with making decisions about it. But it always helps to see if someone's actually using their rights or not. Or if somebody has read and write privileges and they're only reading. These things are going to help me make decisions. But again, I know the data best. So in addition to these little hints that get rolled up, I might just happen to know that Susan has moved on to another department. I'm going to take her privileges away altogether. Or, Ruthie has left the organization. I'm going to remove her privileges as well. So this really helps me as the data owner give my feedback to make good decisions. And of course, I want to enter any notes associated with these changes so that can be saved and auditable going forward, and you maintain a record. Last thing I'll add here is self-service access requests, right? In addition to attesting to these things on a scheduled basis, you also want to empower the end users to ask for privileges in the places where they might not have, right? So back to that example where I'm not part of the sales department, but I work in finance and I've been assigned a project that requires me to access the sales area for a particular period of time. You want to give me that self-service portal where I can request it. I can enter a note associated with my request, justifying why I need it. And then that approver can say, what kind of rights they want to give me and for how long, and say, okay, great. You're working on a project for the next couple months. I'm going to approve 60 days of access to this particular resource. And I'm going to give you read only because that's all you need to do the project. And now those notes on both sides are captured of, who asked for it and what their justification was and who approved it and what notes are associated with that approval. And you can always go back. You always have a defensible audit trail. You're not on the hook for, those permissions decisions. It's not your data. You don't know why someone should or shouldn't have access. You need to bring that down to the business level, to the people that, that work with that content. Let them make the decisions and provide that audit trail for you of why a decision was made. So a little bit about how we facilitate all of this, and then I want to walk you through some examples of how to do it. Right. So if you remember when I brought up the 5 phases of maturity, right in the middle of the 5 phases we talked about activity. Right. That was phase 3, and that's where we start to bring agents into the equation. Before that, everything is either agentless or proxy based. So agentless meaning we're going out, we're doing that host discovery, identifying what kind of machines exist on the network and what their purpose is, whether it's an Exchange server or a SharePoint farm or SQL instances, file shares. You want to know what exists and where, and some semblance of priority of what to start auditing. You're going to do that before you ever deploy any agents. Furthermore, you can start to understand without the use of agents where there's sensitive content and who has access to that sensitive content. Those agents come into play when you want to start collecting real-time events. Who did what, when, and where, and not only maintain that precise forensic history, but feed it into your UBA on an ongoing basis to prevent any kind of threats against that data. So this is, very high-level approach of how that architecture operates, and this applies to any platform you want to work with, on-prem, in the cloud, collaboration. We support dozens and dozens of different platforms, as well as our AnyData connector that will allow you to audit anything with a REST API. So these are the products that facilitate everything we've talked about so far. First and foremost, and most pertinent to today's discussion, is Stealth Audit. This is going to give you everything you need to understand which systems have data, where that data might be sensitive or regulated, who has access to it, what they're doing with it, getting to a least privilege model, and putting the right governance workflows in place for ongoing attestation and self-service access requests. That applies to your data on-prem, in the cloud, structured data, unstructured data, all facilitated by Stealth Audit. Then when you move into real-time threat detection and response, that's what Stealth Defend is for. So that's your user behavior analytics, proactively stopping threats against Active Directory and threats against your data, running playbooks to not only notify the right people, but prevent exfiltration and prevent abuse of that content. Going deeper into the Active Directory realm, we've got Stealth Intercept. And this is going to give you additional policy enforcement. So if you wanted to block the use of unsafe passwords or block malicious or unsafe changes to Active Directory, that's the policy enforcement you're going to get from Stealth Intercept. Then Privilege Access Management gives you session recording and the ability to assign, just in time, just enough privilege to, carry out a given privilege task. Then you've got Stealth Recover. Usually when an attacker is trying to create persistence within an environment, one of the first things they do is they start messing around with settings in Active Directory and giving themselves rights to all sorts of things, or making changes that are going to compromise the security of your domain. So if you detect something like that, Stealth Recover is an excellent way to revert all the changes that attacker made, in a given time period. So object level recovery, you go all the way down to the object level and revert the changes, that particular user made through the Stealth Recover platform. So that's a high level look at the solution portfolio as a whole. I want to give you a use case demonstration now and take you through some of the things that we discussed, like shutting down open access, identifying sensitive data, who has access to it, what they're doing with it, proactively stopping threats, achieving least privilege, and implementing a good governance model going forward. I'm going to do a quick demonstration here to wrap things up. So I'm looking at the Stealthbits web interface. I'm going to log in, and you'll notice I've got 4 tabs on the top here that essentially encompass what we've discussed. I've got my reporting, I've got my access auditing, I've got my proactive threat protection, and then I've got that recovery ability if I want to start reverting malicious changes within Active Directory. I'm going to start with access here. I can certainly search for anything I want to search for, whether it's a person or a type of data or a particular folder or SharePoint site or whatever, but I can also browse. And this is just a high-level look at all the systems that I'm auditing right now. And I could dig down into a particular system and start to get an idea of where my risks are. If there are open shares, I want to understand where those are and how those things are open, right? So I can see I've got the everyone group directly applied to this particular area. Same thing if I go to finance here, I've got the everyone group directly applied to my financials folder. So this is just bubbling up some high-level conditions I might want to look at right off the bat. But I can investigate anything I want. If I am looking at a particular folder and I want to understand what kind of data resides within that folder, I've got this sensitive content view, so I can see which sensitive files were found here, what rule that matched on, and then I want to know who has access to that sensitive content. So in this case, it's showing me a simplified view of all the people who have access to the information in this folder, and I could click on a particular person, and it's going to explain exactly how that person has access. So in this case, Bob has access to the accounting folder a number of different ways, and it's going to explain that down here, both share permissions, file system permissions, and network logon policy. So it gives me a complete view into not just who has access, but where that access is coming from. Then we can get into activity details. If I scroll back over a particular date range, I want to know what's been done with that data. Who's reading, writing, deleting, making changes. I want to know the precise forensic history of who's interacted with my content. So that's also going to help us when we get into remediation, right? So you really want to think about all the different ways that data can be accessed. I've covered some of them so far. Before I get into the remediation, I also want to draw your attention to other ways that data could be accessed, right? So if I go down to a particular report here, in Stealthbits, we call this shadow access. And what we mean by shadow access is, I don't have access to this data right now, but here's how I could get it. And it's going to draw out all those attack maps for you based on the exploitable permissions that we discovered. So who could modify group memberships, who has database access or share access, who's a local administrator on these different systems, who could reset someone else's password, and numerous other exploitable permissions that might be part of these attack paths. When I look down at the attack path itself, I can see things like Bonnie doesn't have access to credit card numbers right now, but she has the ability to reset Andrea's password. And Andrea can modify the membership of the domain admin group. And then of course, all bets are off, once you're in that domain admin group. So that's a, pretty simplistic example, but you get the idea. Any, permissions that could be exploited to get from a given account to a sensitive target is something that you want to be aware of. And that's why we draw these attack maps to bring that to your attention. So let's go down the path of remediation now. If you want to think about, achieving that resource-based group model, I've got all these different shares queued up for remediation. And this modeling report on the bottom is going to show me what changes would be made. So essentially, what's the differential? Are someone's rights getting dropped down because they're not using? I've got read and write, but I'm only reading, or I have read permission of this folder, but I'm not using it at all. This is going to show you all the little changes that are going to be made to achieve the desired security model in all these different folders. So before I commit this action, I can take a nice thorough look at this report and see who's going to have their access changed from in this case, this level down to this level as a result of not using certain permissions. So take a good look at this before you commit it. There is an undo button if you commit a change that you're not happy with, but it's always better to look at the modeling report first before you apply the action. So once I've committed that action to my file shares, then I want to think about things like putting the right people in charge to manage those resources. So if I go to my resource owners here, I can see, say for example, the finance share. I want to assign the right person to approve access to that area. And when I click on add, it's going to go through that probable owner workflow of who's creating the content, who's working with it the most, and who do those people report to. It pivots all the available information to tell you the most likely owner of a particular resource. So in this case, Chris is the proper owner for the finance share. And now, Chris is going to be the one to fill out the different reviews and things that are coming in. So, from the vantage point of the owner, I can see any pending reviews. In this case, I've got one for this accounting folder that I'm responsible for. This is mine. I'm going to do the review on it, and I can see, who has full control, who has modify, who has read, and I get some hints like this person hasn't even logged into the domain in 60 days. Like, does Chris really still need access to this? And then I could submit these changes along with any associated notes that I want to plug in here. But the nice thing about this is it maintains an audit trail, so I can see the history of what reviews have been performed in the past and any notes associated with it, and I can export this to a report or a spreadsheet or a CSV. Other component to that is the self-service access requests. So if I own a resource and an end user wants access to it, I'm going to get a request. And likewise, it maintains this history where I can see anybody who's asked for access to something in the past, any notes associated with that request, and then why what my decision was, approved, denied. And again, I could export this report for compliance purposes. So now we've talked about how to spot inappropriate access, how to remediate it, how to achieve a least privilege model, how to implement entitlement reviews and self-service access requests on an ongoing basis. I do want to show you the threat models as well. So when I get into real-time threat prevention and response, I can go through all these different things, both attacks against the domain and attacks against the data itself, like an exfiltration attempt or an Active Directory attack or anything else, I can see the different attacks here. I can investigate, and either using the included threat models or my own custom investigation filters, I can pare down different types of things that I want to prevent, whether it's copying data from a file server, or suspicious access to sensitive content or anything else. I can set up my own investigations here and add different filters for who, what, when, where, what type of content, that kind of thing, and then attach playbooks to these things. So when I go to the playbooks panel here, I've got a different playbook associated with different types of attacks. If there's a password spraying attack, I want to force a password reset, make them change their password next time they log in. If there's a golden ticket attack, I probably want to disable that account. How do I want to respond to an LSAS process injection, or someone changing the membership of the sensitive security group, or any of those types of things? So I can choose what types of attacks I want to respond to, and then what action steps I want to include in the response. So over here under actions, I've got a whole bunch of different things I can do. Sometimes it's cool to integrate with like a multi-factor authentication solution. In this case, we did Duo. But down here, we've got this webhook API configuration. You can integrate with just about anything you want in terms of other systems you want to include in your threat response here. I've got syslog. I've also got PowerShell scripting, as well as some pre-built things for Microsoft Teams and Slack and text message and getting information from VirusTotal or whatever you want to do. I've got all these pre-built options in here, as well as the ability to script your own with PowerShell or invoke other things using a REST API. So those are my options there for threat response, to not only detect an attack against my credentials or data, but to actually put a stop to it as well. So with that, I want to bring to your attention all the resources that you have at your disposal. The first of which is our Stealthbits Credential and Data Security Assessment. And you could run this against all the different systems in your environment, structured, unstructured, on-prem, in the cloud. And it's going to highlight your risks, right? So prioritizing everything for you: high risk, medium risk, low risk, so you know what to address first. Things like where you have sensitive information exposed, where you have over permissive access, global access groups applied to access control lists, exploitable conditions within Active Directory, really ties it all together for you. Then we've got the Remote Workforce Security Center, full of best practices and useful tools. I'll make sure everybody receives that link as well. And then for those of you in the healthcare sector, we have the EPHI Security Assessment, designed specifically for healthcare, geared towards identifying where you've got patient records, and a thorough review of your environment to understand any risk to that PHI, again, both on-prem and in the cloud. So these are the resources available to you. I'll make sure everybody receives a copy of these links and this presentation. And with that, I just want to thank all of you for attending today's session, and please be in touch. Look forward to working with all of you.